Lap times. People in the automotive industry love lap times. Magazines love lap times because they get to test out a bunch of different cars and gather proprietary data. Manufacturers love lap times because they get to highlight the enhancements they've made over the outgoing model and an opportunity to one-up the competition. And consumers love lap times, primarily for bragging rights. But I am here to tell you that for 99% of people shopping for a sports car, lap times should not be a primary factor of consideration. And before I dive into the reasons why lap times don't really matter, let's first examine why there's so much emphasis put on them in the first place. At their most basic level, lap times are a tool for comparison. Manufacturers spend tens of millions of dollars to get as much performance out of their car as possible. And we have a lot of different tools to measure this performance. Some of the most common tests performed include 0 to 60 mile per hour runs, 60 mile an hour to 0 braking tests, and lateral G's during figure eights. But the one metric that is able to tie all of these different components together is how fast a car is able to get around a racetrack. Now, from the manufacturer's perspective, this is tremendously helpful for selling cars. They can tell the general public that they added horsepower or redesigned suspension, but until there is hard data to back that up, it's really just hearsay. Many manufacturers will spend tens of millions of research and development dollars testing their cars at racetracks to assure that they are as fast as possible. And when the opportunity comes for that car to set an official time, the manufacturer will have a factory racing driver there to conduct the test. And the other group of people that are primarily responsible for setting lap times are the magazines. I'm talking about Car and Driver, Road and Track, and Motor Trend. The magazines will often gather an entire suite of cars and test them on the same track on the same day with the same driver or drivers. And this is highly beneficial for them because by gathering this proprietary data, they know for a fact that it will help drive magazine sales or clicks on their website. And the first major issue that I will take with lap times is just that you can't really take them at face value. There are so many factors that go into a car setting a certain time. Just a small change to things like temperature, humidity, or the car's setup can have a pretty drastic effect. Now, that being said, generally speaking, if you are testing two different cars on the same racetrack on the same day with the same driver, and there is a 3, 4, or a 5-second gap between them, you can pretty confidently say that one car is actually significantly faster than the other. But that often isn't the case when we are comparing lap times. We will compare cars that were driven on different days with different drivers under different conditions, and in that case, a half-second gap between those two cars really isn't indicative of anything. Take just into account tires alone. We all know that tires can make a massive difference. The difference between a set of all seasons and a set of Michelin Sport Cup 2R tires on the same car on the same track could be nearly 10 seconds. And even if all of these cars do have the same set of tires, the amount of wear can also play a pretty big role. And that's why often during these tests, the manufacturers will bring maybe a dozen tires and continually rotate through them to assure that the driver has peak grip. And to expand on that a little bit, even for some of these magazine tests, the manufacturers might be sending a full race crew to prep and dial in the car. And it's not like all manufacturers are doing this, so there'll be cars there that don't have that advantage. And we also don't know that without that race prep, how much of a deficit those cars are really going to be at. My main point here is just that when we start splitting hairs on lap times without considering all of these other factors that go into setting a given time, I really think it's an exercise in futility. Something else I think we should take into consideration is that by pursuing lap times, I think it's actually made a lot of cars worse. Now, worse is, of course, subjective. And if you only care about how fast your car is able to go, maybe you think they've only gotten better. But if you value a sports car for things like engagement through steering feel, chassis control, the sound of the engine, or aesthetics, then I think you would agree that they have gotten worse. Now, I do think being semi-compromised is one of the charms of a sports car. Making sacrifices in areas such as ride quality, ground clearance, or interior space are all inherent to the experience. But in the pursuit of lap times, I think this can get carried a little bit too far. And the most obvious casualty of this, at least on the engagement front, is the manual transmission. Now, I'm not going to argue that the manual has any real advantages. The dual clutch is empirically better in just about every single way, except for engagement. And we can see on the secondary market for vehicles that were offered with both a dual clutch and a manual transmission, there's a pretty big premium for the manual, which I think shows that the demand for those transmissions is very much still alive. Another way in which sports cars have degraded is ride quality. Having a super stiff suspension setup might be perfect for a racetrack that is smooth as glass, but not so much when you're driving around on the street and trying to dodge potholes. Having a car with different suspension modes for different driving situations does help, but it doesn't completely solve the problem. Additionally, a lot of today's sports cars are starting to feature some really aggressive aerodynamics to help provide downforce at the track, which is great, but it comes at the cost of having a protruding front splitter that's really easy to hit on a curb and really expensive to replace, or a massive rear wing that really hinders rear visibility, or in general, just having a car that looks like it is really overstyled, even if it is all functional. And lastly, many of the sports cars that are on sale today are becoming increasingly adjustable, meaning you can make changes to things like rebound, compression, ride height, or aero. And there is a really famous quote from Colin Chapman, who is the creator of Lotus, that I think perfectly encapsulates this. Make the suspension adjustable, and they will adjust it wrong. And this is all not even to mention the insane amount of driving aids that are coming in new cars, like super advanced traction control that, yes, might make the car faster on the racetrack, but really makes you less engaged with driving the car itself. To zoom back out a little bit, all of these different things that we're talking about, be it super stiff suspension, aerodynamics, or insane driving aids, the amount of performance that these additions are adding is usually pretty marginal. The performance that these parts are adding, I'm not even going to say it's not going to be noticeable on the street. It's not going to be accessible on the street. You're going to need a racetrack driving at 10/10ths to get that extra performance. Now, overall, I still am very impressed and interested in the advancements that these car companies are making. I just question a little bit, what are some of the trade-offs that we are making in pursuit of lap times? And that's because buying a sports car is really an emotional purchase. For many of us, when we first get into cars, it's not because that we heard a car set a fast lap time. It's because of how they look and how they sound. And as much work as the automaker puts into making the car fast, they put nearly an equal amount of work into the car's design and making it aesthetically pleasing. And many of these automakers have really rich histories, and buying a car because you resonate with the brand is just as good of a reason as any. The point here is that just by focusing on lap times, you miss out on the emotional connection and all the other things that make sports cars special. And now for kind of the final point on why I don't think you should really care about lap times. You are not a race car driver. Well, maybe that's not fair. Maybe you are a race car driver, but the vast majority of people that are buying a sports car will never take it to the track. And even if they do take it to the track, 99% of people aren't going to have the skill set to drive that car at 10/10ths. In most cases, the lap times that you see published are done by professional racing drivers, or at the very least, amateurs that have hundreds of hours on the track under their belt. If you're shopping for a sports car and you're deciding between two different models and there is a half-second difference in lap times at a given racetrack, and you're using that as a deciding factor, I think you really need to be realistic about your skill set and your use case. And that's not even to mention that purely just looking at lap times gives no indication of how easy a car is to drive. The slightly slower car in this scenario might have performance that's a lot more accessible, while the theoretically faster car really takes a ultra skilled driver to be able to access that performance. Overall, I think it's just important that we are all realistic about our use case and our skill set. Now, I know I've just spent a lot of time bashing lap times, but that does not mean that they are completely useless. For all the faults that I've pointed out, I still personally love bench racing different cars to figure out what they are capable of under perfect conditions with the right driver. There is an argument to be made that when you're car shopping, you can take lap times into consideration just because you want to know the car's potential, even if you'll never come close to reaching it. And there are lap times that can be more valuable and be used a little bit more empirically than others. For example, with Car and Driver's Lightning Lap, they bring a bunch of cars to the same racetrack on the same day, and they're not driven by professional race car drivers, but instead by a whole bunch of journalists. I think that this provides a lot more insight into what this car's real world performance is, opposed to a factory prepped car driven by a professional racing driver at the Nürburgring. But I'll even admit there, it can still be fun to look at ring times and see what these cars are capable of under the perfect conditions. In closing, just to reiterate, if it's not perfectly clear by now, lap times should not be a primary factor of consideration when shopping for a sports car. There are so many different things that can cause discrepancies in lap times. Track conditions, the car's setup, tires, temperature, humidity, all of these different things that you are not necessarily accounting for. And by focusing on this pursuit of lap times, I think we've actually made some cars worse to drive on the street. And that additional performance that you're trading off for won't even be accessible to you on the street. And unless you're a highly skilled driver, it won't be at the racetrack either. I think buying a sports car should be a decision that is based on emotion and not a decision that is based on data.